back to Catholic Reboot. Today's episode is called The Judas and Us. And the reason I titled that is, I really started thinking, when we're younger, we get this description of Judas and we kind of just go with it, right? And as we get older, a little bit more mature, we start looking at the things in our life and the things that we've done, and Judas doesn't seem so far a stretch from maybe what we also may have done to Christ throughout our life. But before I get into that, it's a good habit every morning to wake up and say, "Good morning, Jesus," right? As I said before, Jesus is a jealous lover, right? And so the first words out of our mouth in the morning is to greet him. It's amazing how you set the pace for your day just doing that. Just "Good morning, Jesus," and then you can get up, right? So before your feet even hit the ground. Now, during the Lenten season, I thought that, I need to do something different because year after year, kind of go through that malaise of, okay, this Lent season, I'm going to give something up, or I'm going to try to double down on my devotions. And I just knew that it always is the same. Things always crept in, and I would get lax. And Easter Sunday comes, and I'm sitting there thinking, boy, I blew another great Lent. So this Lent, I tried to do a couple things. One is I started this podcast. I thought this was going to require me, at least on a daily basis, to do something. The other thing was just setting up a nightly rosary, and that has become beautiful. And quite honestly, it's become more joyful for me because it not only reinforces the faith for me, but seeing everyone show up all the time. I think last night or the night before, it was just awesome to see 12 participants, So Christ always sends these little signs, right? The other thing is I wanted, I had set up a neighborhood site on Facebook. It was a group site, and I was amazed at the number of people from the old neighborhood that came onto that site. I think we're getting close to 7,000 members. But then I thought, why wouldn't I set up a site for our Blessed Mother, right? And so I set up a site called the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Pray for us, right? What's really kind of interesting is, almost 7,000 on one site, and the site for the Blessed Mother, I think I've got 50 people, which is kind of awesome. But it still shows that, the devotions we have take work, right? It's not going to be that instant secular response as was with the neighborhood site. Then what I try to do is I'll try to put some podcasts out there for those people that do join. When I do these podcasts, I actually do write them up, right? But when I actually just go to record, I kind of just go. So sometimes you may notice I am actually reading what I write. Other times I'm just free falling, and they say in music the first take is the best. I think when I look at some of these podcasts, when I free fall, it's the best because it's more heartfelt. All right, so sorry for that long introduction. I was talking about Judas and how we actually many times in our lives could have been a Judas Iscariot, right? And I've often thought that when comparing Judas to St. Peter, Judas did sell Christ out, but Peter denied him. And Peter denied him 3 times. And so you look and you say, well, Peter's a saint, Judas is in hell, right? That's the way we've learned it. I think it's so easy to judge Judas, especially during Holy Thursday. We get this image of Judas and we all kind of hiss, what he did. But let's try something new this Holy Thursday. Let's try some compassion. Now, we all know someone who either attempted suicide or committed suicide. Right? I don't think anybody hasn't been touched by a suicide, either directly or indirectly. And what's the first thing we say when we hear it? We use words of consolation to the people who lost loved ones to suicide, right? We say our first instinct is to say we will pray for them. Now, why do we do that? And we do it for not just because we know that people are hurting, but we know that there's times in our lives that we've gone through great despair, right? And we know that when despair is so great, it's usually because we're departing from the Holy Spirit, right? We're not seeking the graces to reinforce our faith, and we go into this deep despair. I mean, I've known some people, very devout people, they completely lost their faith because they say, "Why would God have allowed this to happen?" So either a death of someone in their life, or a suicide. Also, you've seen marriages break up over it, families break up. And I think the big thing that's missing in that case is forgiveness. You know, even though they say the suicide is the greatest of the mortal sins because it's unforgivable, I think the only thing we can do is forgive, because we don't have the right to judge any soul, even those that committed suicide, because we just don't know Christ's mercy, and we never know at what moment they took their life. Because we all know one thing: we know the devil very well can jump on us, and it can make us do unbelievable things. I don't think anybody can deny some point in their life that's happened where they say, "I can't believe I did that," right? And that's usually the devil. You know, the devil is a master at tempting us to do something very sinful, and saying to us all along the way, "Don't worry about it. Christ will forgive you. It's just this one time." And then once we do it, the devil's the first to start pouring on all the guilt, like, "You're unforgivable. I can't believe you did that. Oh my gosh." And so when they talk about Catholic guilt, what I like to call it is devil guilt, because we know Christ will always forgive us, will always take us back. So guilt is owned by the devil, okay? Christ owns the mercy and love. And so let's discuss Judas. What I like to know is, when I hear someone's name, I like to know what their last name means, because that name came from something, right? Names meant something. It's just over thousands of years of generation, we just lose the sight that a name meant something, right? So, like, for instance, my real last name is not Viola, it's Gabrielli. Viola was a name they gave my grandfather at Ellis Island. We still don't understand that, but we do know our paternal family name was Gabrielli, which we know comes from Archangel Gabriel, and it means God is my strength. And my mother's maiden name was Jaeger, right? She was a German, and that meant hunter. So I'd like to say I'm always hunting for God's strength. I'm combining those two names. When we look at Judas Iscariot's name, right? So Iscariot is the family name. They don't really know what it meant. There's some that claim it was Sicarius, which in Greek was a dagger bearer, right? We would probably classify Judas, what we knew about him before Christ made him an apostle, was a revolutionist. And I've forgotten what movie they actually showing him having some kinship with Barabbas, like they knew each other. And they believe that Judas, his intention was to drive the Romans out of Israel. So this idea of Christ coming along and being, in Judas's eyes, somewhat of that kind of temperament, when Christ asked him to be an apostle, he jumped at it, right? Judas was born in Kerioth, and I can't remember where they get that information, but I did find that's where he came from. Now, many people consider St. Matthew the patron saint of accountants, but I kind of disagree with that. I mean, I shouldn't disagree with the church appointing a patron saint, but Matthew was a tax collector, and me being an accountant, I did a lot of work for my clients, keeping them away from tax collectors. So Judas was considered the accountant for the apostles, or at least in charge of the finances. And they always say the reason he didn't make St. Matthew is because he knew he'd be too tempted. So he gave that to Judas. So Christ chose Judas for that job because of his skills, right? And if you look at the way Christ selected his apostles, he did that for various reasons, So let's stop here just for a minute. If you think about it, Christ's ministry lasted 3 years. So let's not shortchange Judas too quickly. Judas was responsible for keeping the money flowing to pay for all the apostles' needs, right? I mean, they didn't have day jobs. They were full-time apostles going with Christ from town to town, right? So it was a full ministry. And he did a pretty good job. I mean, it's just like many of us. We get so consumed with making money for the family that we tend to take our eye off of Christ. And I can really relate to Judas in that way. That financial responsibility, you're always in the game of trying to make sure where the next dollar is going to come, and you take your eye off Christ. That's why it's so important for mothers. I like to say the father is doing the dirty secular work. The mothers are building the souls of the children. So like us, and I'm going to do a lot of comparison to us, Judas took his eye off Christ. Most of the studies that have been done on Judas say that the principal reason he betrayed Christ was because he was avarice, right? So he suffered the sin of being avarice, which means that he had a greed for wealth or material gain. Now, I would say, don't we all do that? Especially today. It's all about how much money you have, what material possessions you have, how many deposits you have in your bank account. Very few times are we worried about the deposit of our faith, right? Especially among our children. So I think we do the same thing. But I don't think that's what Judas suffered from. And actually, Bishop Sheen did a great job at this, showing that there's gospel evidence maybe for him having the nature of being avarice, right? And let's go through that first. So let's explain that. So just a week before the Passion of Christ, Christ was invited into a house of Simon the Pharisee, and what the host saw, right? So the Pharisee saw was a woman intruder, right? And at that time, a lot of people, because Christ was so popular, that wherever he went, they would kind of follow along, and even stand outside of a house or wherever he was at, and just stand along a wall and try to see if they could listen to the conversation he was having with someone else. Well, this intruder was a woman, and the rabbi probably wouldn't have minded that she was an intruder. It's just when she came in, what she did, right? And she was known to be a sinner as well. And she had very long hair. She didn't attempt to brush it back or anything. And she came towards the table that Jesus was at. And in those days, they had a table that was a reclined table, so they leaned on their left arm so that they could eat with their right hand. Well, she came and stood over Christ, and she was so ashamed of herself. And they said this about Christ, that when you met Christ, if you were of a good heart, just one look from him and you just would either go numb or you knew your sinful state, right? And so the tears started coming down her face, and they fell on Christ's feet, right? And so in those days, the women would wear a small vessel around their neck. And it usually contained some sort of a perfume. And they would use it for certain occasions. If there was funeral rites going on, they would open the bottle and put the remains of that perfume over the corpse. And then sometimes they would even just drop the whole bottle, right? So what she does is she takes this ointment from the vessel, but most people that would do it slow, one drip at a time, because it's very expensive, right? She doesn't do that. She just flows it onto Christ, which they say was to demonstrate that her love had no limits. This precious perfume was like the pouring out of her love, right? Now, they say that Judas, got a whiff of the perfume, and it's funny because Bishop Shane said, Oscar Wilde describes a cynic as one who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. And they say that Judas immediately fixed a price of 300 wages, right? Well, being an accountant, I hate to say it, you do those things. I mean, you immediately understand the value of something. So for him to be able to do that, I didn't find unusual. It's the way he presented it. Okay, so Judas all of a sudden wants to defend what they call the social order of the apostles, and he kind of breaks up the routine going on in the meal or the gathering, and says, "Why wasn't this sold for 300 pennies worth and given to the poor?" Now, you could almost imagine. Now, if you think about Judas, now he's been following Christ throughout his ministry at this point, right? And he heard him speaking on the Mount about the Beatitudes, saying things like, "Blessed are the poor." Probably thinking, "Where's your love for the poor now, Christ?" Right? And then, how about the fishermen that were laying all their nets out at the Sea of Galilee, the amount of work that it would take and the cost to do that, right? And then all those kind of like shanty huts that were along the highway between Jerusalem and Jericho that Christ would have taken his apostles past. The slums, so you could almost understand Judas somewhat calling Christ out, saying, "Where's your love for the poor?" But, like us, he didn't say all that. He just put a value on the loss of the perfume. And we'll do that too. Some of the worst things we have are our thoughts, and we may not necessarily say them, but we're thinking them, right? And it's almost as if Christ read his thoughts, because the way Christ answered was, "The poor you have always with you, me you will not always. And what this good woman has done was done for my burial, and it will be told about her around the world." Okay. Now, of course, what is he talking about? Much like the perfume was used for anointing the dead, uh, what this woman was doing is anointing Christ prior to his passion and cross, right? This was supposedly a week before. But we have to remember that the apostles, and especially Judas, really had no idea what Christ was talking about. I mean, how could they? I know I wouldn't have. I probably would have been lost. I'd have been hanging around constantly saying, what is he talking about? So we're fortunate to know now what he was talking about. But it's like the classic line from Paul Harvey, now you know the rest of the story, right? Or it's almost like a Monday morning quarterback. We as Christians, it's so easy for us to judge knowing everything now. Then they didn't know what he was talking about. But, Bishop Sheen had made a good point about accusing Judas of avarice. He said, avarice is an old man's sin. Sin of youth is lust, and middle age power. Old age avarice, for it's a kind of economic immortality. See how well I have provided for myself? And Judas was not an old man. Avarice, therefore, cannot have been the cause of him leaving Christ. And that was really a good point. And I instinctively never thought it was over avarice. It was much more than that. Now, again, what was the cause? And if you think of the first time the fall of Judas is mentioned in the Gospels, the very first time, if you can remember the moment when there was a break among your own fellow Christians, it's pretty similar, right? So where is the break? It's the mention of when Christ announced the Eucharist at the Last Supper, right? So when did when did Judas leave? The night Christ gave the Eucharist. Judas broke at the announcement of the Eucharist, and that was a critical moment in the life of Christ, right? So he announced the Eucharist, and what we see with many Christians is that's usually the sign when they break from their faith. They first break with the Eucharist, right? So Christ lost some of his disciples, but they usually would come back. They would be moving on. The final break with Judas was the night of the Last Supper, and he officially broke from what they call the apostolic band. And if you look at the conclusion of the 6th chapter of John, and I'm going to go into that, it's explained there. And when the disciples withdrew and no longer went about him, Jesus asked the 12, "Do you also want to leave me?" Simon answered, "Lord, to whom shall we go? Your words are the words of eternal life. We have faith, and we know that you are the Holy One of God." And Jesus answered, "Have I not chosen you, all 12? Yet one of you is a devil." And he was referring to Judas, as they say, the son of Simon Iscariot. He it was who would betray him, and he was one of the 12. So when do we as Christians begin to break? And again, I'm not trying to totally defend Judas. Well, maybe I am. But I'd like to turn the mirror around and look back at myself and say, when did I start to break, if I ever moved away? And it was when I kept myself. I never lost my faith in the Eucharist. I kept myself from the Eucharist. And how do we keep ourselves from the Eucharist? Many ways. Either busy making money or busy sinning, right? If we're busy making money, we're placing material possessions ahead of getting to Mass. If it's Sinful, it means we commit sins and then are reluctant to seek confession in order to receive the Eucharist. But there's a break with the Eucharist, right? And it's almost very predictable for those that leave the faith, because this is usually where it happens. Now, if you look at the 6th chapter of John, which I was referring to, he did not say who the devil was. He merely said, one of you is the devil. It was John later on that wrote the name, right? There has never been a case where when referring to Judas, there's any sort of sympathy. You'll notice that, right? So let's go to the Last Supper and where Judas leaves the faith. I'd like to say he left the faith like we do all the time, right? They just didn't have someone writing a gospel of us leaving the faith. But let's talk about the Last Supper. The seating arrangement at the table was John sat at the right. So who sat at the left? Judas. Okay. Now, if you look at the painting of Leonardo da Vinci, Judas is down the table, and by the way, they said that he spilled the salt, but they show him like fourth down the table, spilling the salt on the left-hand side, right? By the way, this is why it's always bad luck to spill the salt. I don't know if you know that. And he's holding a money bag. And Christ said to him, "Here, Judas, sit near me." And what's so beautiful about that statement, "Here, Judas, sit near me," doesn't Christ constantly call us out, even though he knows we're going to commit a terrible sin, and say, "Sit near me," and we intentionally move further down. We move further away, right? But where was Peter? They say Peter was on the other side of John. You know, Christ then washes the feet of the disciples, and there are 7 gestures mentioned. And it's in the beginning of chapter 13 of John as the Lord is washing their feet. And this is very important. And you can actually see this during the Mass as well, right? But they say that the washing of the feet has pieces of the incarnation and his divinity. Okay, so they say, rise from the table. Christ rose from the table as if he was the Son of God, and that rising from the table to do this act of washing from the feet is related to his incarnation, right? The incarnation of Christ. Then they say he laid aside his garments, and that we refer to as the glory of his divinity, right? Then he's taking a towel, which is a mark of a servant, a slave, trying to identify himself with humanity, and somewhat having humanity tied around him, right? Then he pours the water into a basin, just like he was going to pour out his blood. Then he washed his disciples' feet, just as he cleans us, right? Then he wiped them with a towel. This is the symbol of the purification of the Spirit, right? So it's interesting to compare the passage of the 2nd chapter of Philippians, and I think it's verse 6, where Christ, after washing the feet of the disciples, said, "You are clean, but not all. One of you is about to betray me." Now, 10 said, "Is it I, Lord?" Now, they say in the face of divinity, no one can be sure of innocence, right? But one said, "Who is it, Lord?" And one said, "Who is it, Master?" Okay? Now, it's interesting. Lord, one says Lord, one says Master. And we'll explain who said what, right? But St. Paul said that only by the Spirit can we call Jesus Lord? So 11 called him Lord, 1 called him Master. Who was that one that called him Master? Judas, right? Now, at that particular time, there was a lot of whispering going on, and you kind of understand based on the seating arrangement. So when our Lord said, one of you is about to betray me, Peter was known to be always very curious and inquisitive. He always had to be on top of everything. So, he couldn't bear the suspense, So if he were seated next to Christ, he would never have said to John, ask him who it is. But he did ask John, and John said, who is it, Lord? Who is it? And the Lord said, it is he to whom I will reach this bread after I have dipped it in the sauce, right? Now, in those days, that was the way you toasted. You would dip the bread in sauce and give it to a friend, right? Now, what was Christ doing in that act? He was saying, whoever took it and ate it was now the same as him, in that they were receiving his body. Well, in the custom, that was actually pretty much the same. That gesture of handing the bread to someone after you dipped it is you became joined together, right? Now, after Christ had dipped the bread and gave it to Judas, he said, what you are about to do quickly. And they say, then Satan entered into Judas, right? I mean, the gospel says, and Judas went out, and it was night. And what's interesting, it always seems like it's night when we leave Christ, right? The darkest time. And again, rather than just looking at Judas went out in the night, I look at how many times we did the exact same thing, okay? So, none of the other apostles at the table knew what was happening, because the gospel tells us they thought Judas had just gone out to either buy food for Passover or else to give money to the poor. Those were his job functions. Not only was he responsible for the money, but he would make sure money went to the poor. He would be purchasing the food, right? So, in other words, when we look for any time we fall in the state of sin, we will say Satan entered into us, and that's what they were saying about Judas, that Satan was in him, and then after that he leaves, and Christ pronounces that the word now, right? So he says, now, Father, glorify thy Son with the glory that I have with thee before the foundation of the world was laid, right? Now, I will have to tell you that if I were in the company of Jesus and he would have said those words, now, Father, glorify thy Son with the glory that I had with thee before the foundation of the world was laid, I probably would have said, whoa, what? There he is, basically announcing not only his incarnation, but his passion and death and being the Messiah. So it was pretty evident what he was saying, right? So then Christ prepares to go to the garden. Now, there's only one recorded time in the life of Christ that he ever sang, and that was that night he went out to his death. Most people don't know that. So they go into the garden, and he thought he could depend on at least 3 of his apostles, Peter, James, and John. Mostly John, because they always referred to John as rather the loving member of the apostles, very close to Christ. Matter of fact, in the book by Anne Catherick Emmerich on the Passion of Christ, she said the vision she saw before they sat at the table for the Last Supper was Christ on the side talking to John, and that Peter and the others were very jealous. So there's that human instinct, right? So at least, back to my point, at least John would have been attentive, right? Peter was kind of considered the loyalist in an intense kind of way. So you understand why Christ had asked those three. John, because he's very loving. Peter, because he was somewhat of a loyalist. And James, they said, was always ready to follow Christ's leadership. And again, in the book of Anne Catherick Emmerich, she was saying that Christ knew they would not be able to stay awake, because if they would have been able to experience the pain he was going to go through, because he was tortured by the devil at that time, that's why he bled, he sweated blood, right? That it was almost a spiritual sleep that they were in. I've never heard that before. But in any event, what did he tell them? He told them to watch and pray. Watch, pray. But they slept, right? So men who are generally worried about something don't sleep, right? But they slept. So 3 times Christ came back to them and said, "Can you not stay awake 1 hour with me?" Right? Just that one night, right? Well, again, I put myself in their shoes, and I know I very easily could have done the same thing. I mean, if you really stop and think about it, he was asking them in an hour, right? But we barely give Christ an hour in a week, and that was just one night, right? So again, I turned the mirror around on that one. Now, on the opposite hill of the garden, there was a sight of lanterns and a group of men. And there was a Greek word used called spira. And spira means about 200 in the army that Judas had brought. And it was a full moon that night. So it was very easy to distinguish anyone in the dark. So, and additionally, Christ was well known in Jerusalem. Everyone saw him at least the Sunday before, on Palm Sunday. And Judas leads this band of guards down the hill and tells them, "I will give you a sign," right? Whoever I kiss, that is Christ. That is him. Take a hold of him. But, you know, I always wondered, why did he have to give a sign if Christ was so well known in a kiss, right? And I think there's two reasons for this. One is the reason we can show this affection or disingenuous affection is whenever we leave something that we love, we will have this pretend remaining affection, right? And when I hear that Judas gave Christ the kiss to identify, the only thing I could think of is he knew this was the end of it for him, but he also could have thought that in the past Christ would disappear. You remember some of the Gospels that when Christ's life was threatened, he would disappear into the crowd. And so Judas was around. He saw that. So I think the other reason was he thought that in a cowardice way, Christ would run back into the Olive Garden and try to hide somewhere. So then he would have had to flush him out with the guards. So just as soon as Judas went up to give him a kiss, he basically told him, seize him right then and there. So that explains the kiss, right? Now, what was interesting is, because Christ knew all that, right? When Christ comes forward, and you see this in the Passion of Christ, it's really beautiful with that full moon. You see Christ step into the light of the full moon. And he says, "Who do you seek?" And one of the guards yells out, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Christ says, "I am," right? Like, I am who am, right? I am. And they say with the power of the way he said it, they all fall back. They all fall backwards. They're like blown away, like the thunder of God just came out. I am, right? And they say until Christ gave them the strength to stand. It shows the power all the way to the end was always his to give, right? So then Judas throws his arms around the neck of Christ and gives him a kiss. In the original gospel writing, they don't just say a kiss. It's like he smothered him with kisses, right? With the common "Hail, Rabbi," right? So there's a great analogy of Judas's kiss, because we all know that Christ responded by saying, "Why do you betray me with a kiss?" Right? And Christ knew why Judas was doing that. But like Adam in the garden, when God the Father asked him, "Why do you hide from me?" what Christ was looking for was some sort of penance on behalf of Judas to say, "I'm sorry, I betrayed you." Just like Peter, if you stop and think about it, Peter betrayed him 3 times, but was so remorseful and asked for forgiveness, right? But you also notice that neither Adam nor Judas did, right? So because of Adam didn't, we suffered original sin. Judas didn't, and he suffered the final sin, right, of despair, right? But what's also very interesting about this is the betrayals of both Judas and Peter came from within Christ's church, within his apostles, right? Just like it happens with our Catholic Church, right? So there's a comparison with St. Peter and Ezekiel, right? So Ezekiel in the Old Testament was discussing the destruction of the temple and the persecution of Peter of the church was going to come from within. So both Peter and Ezekiel said, "Begin at my sanctuary." And Peter said, "That's the way it will be all the way until the end." So even in times now, if we see the real destruction to the Catholic Church, God's one holy apostolic church, it's coming mostly from within. All right, so now let's get back to Judas. He has the money. They say that if they look at the value of that money, it was really only about $17 or $18 if we were to do a conversion. And isn't it amazing at how little we betray Christ, even us, the ridiculous sum that we will give up Christ in our lives, right? But afterwards, then Judas is sick of it. There's the devil, right? Just tempt. Once the sin is committed, now the guilt, and Judas is sick of it, and he goes back and throws the 30 pieces across the temple floor, right? He couldn't take it, but yet he still couldn't try to hunt Christ down through the passion and yell out asking for forgiveness. And we do that all the time. We just stay in that rut we're in, grumbling and cursing instead of just seeking for forgiveness, right? So what happened with Judas is he no longer had any hope. And knowing that he was not going to come back to Christ, he takes the rope out and he goes to the rocky ground, right? And Judas is full of despair, and he walks over the rocky ground, and they say each rock seemed just as hard and cruel as his own heart, right? So we always know that when we do this, mea culpa, we're breaking our rocky heart. That's the reason for that gesture. And they said the limb of every tree seemed like pointing a finger at him, saying, "Traitor, traitor, traitor," right? In the great movie Passion of Christ, you see all those little demons chasing him and all those visuals that he's getting, right? Being accused of a traitor, being spit on, right? That's the perfect representation of the devil. They said the knot on every tree seemed to be like an accusing eye, and he hanged himself. And this is mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, and they say his bowels burst asunder, and he went to his own place, right? Now, of course, that own place was construed as being hell. But if we look at those stone hearts that left our faith, our Catholic Church, you see that they did it somewhat the same way. It was, they left the Eucharist. They left Christ present, and they no longer saw the presence of Christ. And I'd like to say, in a great tragedy of the life of Judas, that just if he would have just sought back the Eucharist, if he would have just sought back to get that forgiveness, I may have had my wish, and there would be a Saint Judas, the patron saint of accountants. So let's not only lose the sight that we in our life have been Judas many a times, but we also don't want to lose the Eucharist, because we want to lose our chance for sainthood with Christ as well. So keep that in your mind on Holy Thursday. Thank you, and I hope this helped in some way.